I'm Ellie Kusner. I'm the chair of the Dance Educators Committee for IADMS. I'm also an MSc in Dance Science and a Pilates and a dance instructor. And today we're going to be talking through some basic safety concerns with a few professionals who I'll introduce in a moment. And just sort of reflecting on our experiences and then inviting questions and comments from all of you who are out there. All of us have talked about how we're very concerned about the safety of your students, but we're very concerned about the safety of you as well. This is a stressful time for everyone, not just for your students. And some of you, might be struggling with caregiving and teaching and working safely in your own home and balancing boundaries, which are already challenging. You might be really stressed financially. I know that if you're a studio teacher or a studio owner, in addition to all the stress that comes with the global pandemic, you might have really substantial concerns about how you're going to exist moving forward. So I just want you to know that we know that and we hear you, and we're thinking about you, and we want to try to help you as best we can. So without further delay, I want to introduce these panelists. We have Jen Deckert. I want to give a wave, Jen. That's Jen. She's an MFA, and she's on the IADMS Board of Directors and an associate professor of dance at the University of South Carolina. And then we have Sonia Rafferty, who's calling in from London. She is an MSc as well in dance science, and she also is Safe in Dance International co-founder and Trinity Laban Conservatoire of Music and Dance senior lecturer. And then on that last panel there is Sutton. Hi, Sutton. And Sutton is also an MSc from Laban, like many of us. And she is an IADMS staff member and Safe in Dance International provider, as well as a Pilates and dance instructor. She's calling in from Colorado. And not on this call is Maggie Morris, who is a Master's of Arts and Performing Arts and Education advisor, as well as the co-founder with Sonia of Safe in Dance International. So we're going to start with Sonia. Sonia, if you could take us through some basic safety guidelines, could you maybe start by saying how we create a safe space? What do we need to consider in terms of sort of emotional and physical well-being during this time in quarantine?
Yeah, thanks, Ellie. So if I just give a little brief introduction before I go straight into that question, if that's okay. So although I'm mostly representing Safe in Dance International today, I'm also an undergraduate program leader in higher education and a dance technique teacher. So I'm having to negotiate the situation myself practically, as well as providing advice for the sector. And you struck a really important chord there when you say we have to look after ourselves as practitioners, as well as providing advice for other people. This has happened in a pretty short space of time. And teachers have had to find ways of really adapting very, very quickly and teaching accessibly in a really different way. It might not be alien to all of us to teach online, but to most of us it probably will be. And I just want to say it's understandable that a lot of firefighting has been going on. We all know we've had to get things ready quickly, and perhaps we haven't packaged our materials online in the way that we would like to, or having had time to consider the safe elements of what that is. There's a difference in pedagogy and healthy practice. At SiDI, we always say a safe teacher is a good teacher, but there are some things we're all having to consider about the pedagogy, the necessity of adapting material online, that perhaps we haven't quite got to the safe practice elements yet. So the environmental things are pretty much the common sense things that we can think about. And basically space is the big thing that we all find ourselves in isolation, in quarantine, and very, very likely in a very small space that we're not used to working at all. We've all had to learn about Zoom, about Microsoft Teams, about House Party, about Google Hangouts. All these different things have put a massive strain on us because we're having to upskill really, really quickly. And I'm stating the very obvious. Dance is a physical, sensory, social, emotional experience that we're desperately trying to translate into what is essentially distance learning. So everything's been a very steep learning curve, and I don't want people to think that we're saying, have you done this? Have you done this? You must do this. You must do that. So today is really sort of shining a light on, oh yeah, I didn't think of that, or well, maybe now that I'm sorted a little bit, I can start thinking about this in a different way. So while it hasn't been at the forefront of our thinking, maybe now that we're easing into it and it's becoming a more long-term thing, that we can think about, right, how do I place this now? How do I teach in this way? There are some guiding principles that Safe in Dance International, otherwise known as SiDI, has. And one of our basic principles is don't just teach the people in front of you. Now, that is completely changed now. We can see our students, but can you really see them? Can you see them this way? You can't see them in the way that we normally see them. So that will affect how we relate to them. There are obvious difficulties that arise with that in terms of safe practice, but because you can't uphold the normal principles that we would usually advise as Safe in Dance International in a normal situation. So we're seeing, I do want to stress that there are different sectors that we work in, the community participation sector, higher education, the professional arena, and a lot of these guidelines might be different in each context, depending on the purpose and the reason that you're putting these classes online. So one very basic thing, the first question you asked me, Ellie, is how can we create a safe space considering all of these things, which are huge? So if you're working live, or that new word that we've all become very familiar with, synchronously, can you actually see your dancers? I can see 4 panelists here in a very contained little frame. And this is quite likely what we'll be seeing if you engage with Zoom to teach your classes online. So you're having a very restricted view of that. So in terms of the space that you have available, can you see that where they're dancing? I mean, are they in the kitchen with other family members making lunch around them? Is the dog running around? Is there a computer lead? Do they have to plug their phone in right next to a wall and watch it on there? These are sort of minute little details that affects the way, not just the amount of space people have, but the way they can use it. So are you expecting them to access your class at a predetermined time, which for some people might be 6 a.m. or 12 p.m. Yeah, is that if it's synchronous, are you asking them to come to a place of dancing at a time when they don't normally do it? So these are some of the slightly different aspects of the environment that we might not think about over and above how much space do I have when I'm dancing. So your question was, how can we create a safe space? It's very difficult. It's very difficult. But we can, I think a subsequent question will be, shall we help people to risk assess their space? And the answer is yes. But what does that mean? What does risk assessing your space mean? And I'll answer some of the points about that in the subsequent questions, because I don't want to go on and on and on. So does that answer a very basic creating a safe space, creating a safe environment? Yes, it's necessary, but it might not be as we know it previously.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I think we also have to talk about is just like the safety of the emotional, psychological space that students are in. A lot of students come to dance and it's their safe space. So, you know, not all homes are happy, healthy homes. So just thinking about that as well, that's not the expertise of this particular panel. IADMS has a series of mental health panels happening as well, but that also I think is something we need to think about as teachers. And when we see the behaviors that are happening on Zoom that we've not seen in the studio before, considering all that might be going on there. So what you were alluding to, Sonia, in terms of how much should we help? So knowing that we're dealing with these sort of atypical, challenging environments, how involved should teachers get in helping students risk assess their own space?
Well, SiDI would normally advise all teachers to do a risk assessment for wherever they teach. And sometimes in an institution, you will have that done for you. A normal dance-specific environment, we don't often have to think about that. But in different sectors, in different places that we do dance, some community teachers, some independent teachers will be having to do those risk assessments anyway. So it's a normal part. Risk assessment is a normal part of what we advise for SiDI anyway. Risk assessment, there's two things there. One is knowing the risk and one is assessing the risk. Now, there's a disjunct between that because we can tell people what the risks might be of the situation, but we have no way of personally assessing that. So in answer to your question, clearly the responsibility for risk assessment has now been shifted between participants and teachers. We have to trust that dancers will do as we ask if we ask them to make their space safe. They can't transform their space into a sprung floor, lots of space. You know, they might be dancing on their kitchen floor. They might be dancing on carpet tiles. They might have 1 square meter of space on their bedroom floor. So what we can't do is really assess the risk. We can identify the risk. And I think there is a responsibility that teachers who are used to doing this sort of thing should provide a check of some kind at the beginning of their class and say, have you got enough space? Well, quite likely you haven't. Therefore, you need to approach the material I'm giving you in this particular way. We can probably say that nobody has a perfect or an ideal dance environment. Everybody will be restricted. So that will inform you about what you are offering as well. So yes, clearly the responsibility is now shared, and yes, clearly teachers should be highlighting and identifying what the risks are and how they might be mediated in the current situation. Not solved, not eradicated, not overcome, but mediated. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think that's great. Asking students, do you see that lamp behind you? Or, questions like that. Is that what you have in mind? That sort of.
Yeah. Also, you may be doing asynchronous teaching. You might not be able to see the lamp behind them. Yeah. And certainly on the gallery view, you're going to see a plant, but you're not going to see the whole body in space. That's another thing. So that will have consequences for your instruction if you're able to instruct. But certainly in the space, you'll be saying, okay, if you have a hard floor, I'd suggest you wear some cushioned shoes, even though you wouldn't do normally. Make sure you have your water next to you. Make sure that you're not in the kitchen next to a plugged-in kettle.
Right.
I mean, it's common sense, really, but it's things we don't normally have to think about as teachers because we're in these environments that are made for us to dance in. As I say, we can't stop people dancing. We don't know where they're dancing. It's just our responsibility now is simply to highlight the things that people might not have thought about before.
And I think there is an advantage in all of this in terms of autonomy for students, really coaching students into doing their own risk assessment. I mean, all students should be going to a convention and looking around at the space that they have to work with and deciding if it's safe and appropriate for them. I mean, it's a lot to ask of an 8-year-old, but you can start to instill some of those ideas at a young age even. So there are going to be upsides that come from all of this, and we can talk more about what those are. And I think just to finish, Sonia, if you could just give us an idea of what things might need to be abandoned during this time and what things could be maybe augmented or added in during this time, which we can't normally do in our studio spaces.
Yeah. So I'm not sure it's a thing about abandoning, but it's certainly adapting and it's certainly thinking differently about what you offer. I would say, having watched some of the online provisions so far, it's changing rapidly when people are now becoming clued up as to what this means to deliver online, either live, synchronously or asynchronously, is think about making your own material in a small space. It sounds very obvious, but I've seen a lot of, dancing, and then here's something you could do at home. It won't work if the material is not designed for the small space. So it's all very well, if you've got a fantastic garden or a nice studio that you live in or a big open plan apartment, but your students and your pretty much anybody wanting to take a class will probably have a tiny space. So how can we make content that will able to be performed or experienced in that context? And again, it sounds obvious, but I'm not seeing that across the board. I'm seeing that people are going, hey, jog around the studio or do this. And, well, I can't do that. And the reason I'm bringing that up is the student or the participant themselves will then have to make the adjustment. And we were talking earlier about the amount of information and adjustments that people are making. So this is just something else for them to do as they're trying to watch or follow on your class. So I would say number one is make the material for a small space. The scale and pace of the material definitely needs to change. We're used to 1.5-hour classes, few hours rehearsals, 2-hour sessions. I think try not to cram everything into one session to save the brain and to give people time to experience what you're doing in a different way. There's an issue with who is accessing your class. Are you making it for your individual students that you know very well? You know their level of ability, you know their technical strengths and weaknesses? Or are you making a class, for example, a studio owner who needs to keep the income coming in? Are you making a class to go online? And in that case, you're going to have to give options and highlights. If you're used to doing this, do this option. If you're not used to doing this, if you want to take it slow today, here's this option. And if you want to do this, here's that option. So a broader base, I would say, less material, more open pace and space, and awareness of options for different people who might be accessing your class that don't normally access your class. Picking up material is going to be different. It's two-dimensional. We're looking forward. We're trying to dance like this. Bring that into consideration. We were talking about jumps and turns and things like that. When you're trying to watch and you've got anything three-dimensional going on, like a jump or a fall, and you're disappearing from the screen, clearly that's going to be very difficult to follow live. Yes, pre-recorded, you might be able to stop and go, okay, I'll just investigate that for a little bit. But certainly synchronous teaching, live teaching, it's got to be slower and calmer and less ambitious, I would say. So watching a screen for all of us is really draining, really demanding, and I'm sure that fatigue, the mental and physical fatigue that always comes with dancing, will be heightened in a different way. So I would say condense the class definitely. 30 to 40 minutes material is more than enough. And let dancers try out what they get from your class in their own time.
Great. Yeah, I have found that actually this has been a great opportunity for teaching students how to modify things, because I have to do a lot of, here's version A, the most simple one. Now I'm going to do version B, but you can still do A. Here's version C, but you can still do A or B. And that I am finding actually is a great way to coach students into learning how to modify material. I'm looking at the Facebook app here to get some of your comments, everyone. And I saw that at the beginning, the sound was a little spotty. I want to let you know, if you can hear us, that this is being recorded and it will be available in its full length, either on YouTube or other platforms. So if you're catching what you can catch, that's great. I also want to say that if you have questions, feel free to post them here and we'll try to get to some of them. Here's one from Paul, and it says, let's see if I can click here. I feel like I'm in another generation that I can't manage to get this comment to pull up to full length. Ballet specific question, doubled over yoga mat for jumping. Okay, so I can't see your won't comment for some reason. Paul, I'm going to work on my tech savviness, but I think he's getting towards jumping. And I don't know if that is a big issue. I've heard before we went live, people were asking about that. So I don't know if you want to get into that now, Sonia, or at least touch on it, and we can direct people to some other resources.
So it depends how much jumping, and it depends what, a doubled over yoga mat, it must be secure and doesn't spring open, and people are tripping over it and things, but it's going to provide some element of cushioning, but it's not resilient. It's not got the spring behind it. So yes, it will mediate the effect on the body, the forces through the body and the feet and the legs, but I would say reduce the amount of jumps that you're going to do. And if you are doing jumps, that they're simple, very simple. I would say none of us are doing Grand Allegro at the moment. Definitely not. It's simple, exercises for the feet and the legs, a little bit of, elevation, but very simple, and certainly not as much as you would be doing normally. With the proviso, telling your students or the people you expect to be doing the class that you will be including some springs or jumps in your session. That gives them the advance warning for preparation in terms of warm up for themselves. That's something I'd like to come on to in a minute as well. You asked about what things they might include in a virtual class that they don't do in person. So I'd like to talk about warm up.
Go for it.
Maybe next, if that's okay.
Sure. I guess also with the jumps, it's just so hard to know, Paul, if that doubled up yoga mat is over cement floor or over a hardwood floor that's over cement, or a hardwood floor that's over some baseboards. So it's really hard to know. It might also be a time to pull out the sneakers, or as you all would say across the pond, the trainers, that this might be the time for a change in footwear, which then might reduce your ability to do complicated footwork, but you might realistically be able to go up and down a few times with a different type of footwear. And then if you just if you'd like to go on into the next point, Sonia,
the warm-up and cool-down. So this might not be necessarily new to most dance teachers, because you might include a warm-up. I'm talking a physiological warm-up, not a class preparatory exercises warm-up. You may do this as part of your normal session anyway, but often a lot of us trust our dancers that they're able to understand what that means and getting ready. And some of those first classes online that I've seen are straight in, hey, we all need to do something. Let's go, which is fantastic for motivation. But really, I think we have to think about giving some assistance in preparing for what you're asking to do. It depends on who you're teaching, the context that you're teaching. But I would say for everybody now, I think we could start including some physiological warm-up at the beginning of our sessions. And that means a short pulse raiser, a little bit of a pulse raiser, some easing out and mobilization of the joints, and some dynamic stretching to get people ready. 10 minutes, before you actually start the material that you want to deliver. I think a guided warm-up is a really good thing to do. Often people say, don't forget to warm up before you start. Now, how do you know that people know how to warm up for your class? They might never have done it before. They might not be familiar with you. So I'd say it's really good practice now to start introducing this physiological warm-up. And I'd recommend everybody to think about what that is if you haven't done it before. Same with a cool down, top and tailing of session. That don't just stop, hey, we're all sweaty, we've been really fantastic. Thanks, guys, see you next time. Is okay, we're just going to calm down. We're going to bring our heart rates down. We're going to do some static stretching. We're going to have some recovery, and see you next time. So I think the warm-up and cool-down is we talked about upskilling as well, is really something to look at if you're not familiar with what that physiological approach is, because I think it's really necessary in this situation.
Great. There was a comment about professionals. It's true, we don't tend to address the educators of professional dancers as much in the work that we do. So I'm gonna table that for further thought. if you're listening. Stephanie is just saying that I appreciate the aspects about modification strategies, and says working with known parties of varying age groups, and I find it very helpful to begin aspects of movement and intention, weaves self-soothing like tapping and qigong and mini meditations, especially with the levels of anxieties that are out there with the unfamiliar format and with of course the pandemic. So I just wanted to share that because I think that's really great, Stephanie. I was reminded recently by a psychologist that exercise is very, very good for defending against depression, but is not necessarily mediating for anxiety. So because of the sympathetic nervous system getting amped up, exercise can actually stimulate or keep anxiety going. So I think that's really just such a great idea. And this is a great time for mental practice, really coaching students to visualize, and visualization can be highly effective in terms of skill building, and also effective in terms of parasympathetic connection and sort of dropping down into breath and grounding. So I just wanted to share that. I think that's great. And Joe Bowie. Hi, Joe. Do you recommend more somatic and conditioning work at this time in lieu of only technique classes? I think I'm going to save that. We're going to come back to that when we talk all together as a group, but I think we're definitely going to address that in a little bit. Let's see, one more thing here. Elizabeth, some schools are teaching 1- and 2-legged jumps and expecting dancers to do them. How can we coach dance students to communicate their preference to not jump for safety reasons? Well, Elizabeth, I know you and I know the work that you do. And I think you are the person, this is a very important thing. I think this gets to advocating, and students need to be able to advocate for themselves in this time and speak to what they do and do not feel comfortable with. And I think that is our duty as educators to make space for that. And I think it's really important during this time that we all accept that we will probably not progress certain elements of our dancing during this time. Our leaps and turns will probably not get better during this time, but there are other skills that we can work on. And one of them is advocating for ourselves. So I just think that we as teachers have a duty to just be very receptive to the information that we're getting from students in terms of taking care of themselves. And let's move on into Sutton. Thank you so much, Sonia, and we'll open this up to a broader panel, but I just want to talk to Sutton for a moment about her experience. So she works for SiDI as a provider, providing information about safe dance practice, and is a dance educator. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the dance education that you provide, Sutton, and what population you're working with?
Yeah, so I teach for a local dance studio in Colorado, and it's a very competitive focused studio. So they have already missed 3 out of their competitions already this year. So I think being a competition studio, they are there's an additional thing that they feel like they're losing out on or missing out on rather than just a normal dance class. The ages that I teach 3 different levels, 6 to 8. And then the middle school age, 9 to 12, and then early high school age. And I see kind of the same thing in all 3 levels of what their challenges are, and then very different things in classes that I wasn't expecting. But it's a local studio, and I teach their modern, I teach a ballet technique, and I teach a Pilates class for that studio.
Do you want to talk us through a little bit of what your experience has been?
You're muted.
Thank you. All the new catchphrases that we're getting familiar with.
Yes.
Could you just tell us a little bit about what your experience going online has been and how you're managing it and what you're seeing and what struggles have come up for you and things like that?
Yeah, I think some of the points that Sonia made, I was like, yep, I relate to that. Yes, I relate to that. Yes, I relate to that. I think that some of it is their motivation and their distraction. So the first week they came on, it was kind of like this cool thing. And it was like, hey, we're seeing everybody's house and, it was kind of an exciting time. And then as the weeks have progressed on, it's become, they're really tired. They kind of don't want to look at a screen any longer because they just had to do 3-4 hours of schoolwork right before. And especially like my high school middle age is also on their cell phones quite a bit as well. So they're adding their own screen time on. Mm-hmm. So I think they're feeling really unfocused and really unmotivated. So I'm having to pull them into the space a little bit differently of like refocusing them. And then particularly for my younger dancers is the amount of distraction. It's to the point where if they hear a door close outside, they're immediately like, I think someone needs me. I need to go outside and check the door. I mean, they can't stay within the space where their dog walks by and then they want to show their dog off to everybody. So it's become like constantly, of Sonia's point of having to reduce the material that's in your class. I may be getting through 10% of what I would in a normal session because we're having to constantly kind of like reconvene everybody and like refocus, and I'm having to bring everyone's attention back. So I think to Sonia's point about the physical warm up is I'm also trying to use that time as their centering, like welcome to dance class, welcome to your dance space, be in your dance space. I'm also trying to use the physical warm up as a mental warm up as well, to say like, we're in dance class right now. In dance class, these are expectations, to help them remember that you're not in your living room where you're usually hanging out, but you're in a space. We have something intentional. This is our goal. And so I'm trying to get them to understand that like, this is what we're going to achieve in this next hour or 40 minutes or 30 minutes. So that way we can kind of progress along with this goal in the class to help keep them involved. I think my older students are really struggling on the social component. Mm-hmm. They miss their friends. They miss their dancers. When we're also trying to prepare for a recital that might or might not happen. And a lot of my modern work has to do with like creating together and a lot of physical interaction. And they're not, and I can sense the frustration that they're experiencing throughout that time. So I'm trying to be and I'm like, guys, I get it. I know exactly how you're feeling. So I try to be very sympathetic towards what they're feeling and re-guide that emotion and say like, you're frustrated. That's okay. It's okay to be frustrated at this time. And let's push through this to another thing that we can focus on, or another way that we can move, or another way that we can create movement. So it's teaching me a lot of patience as being their teacher to try to guide them through the 40 minutes that we've done. And our studio, fortunately, to Sonia's point of reducing the time that they're in class, we do have normally like hour sessions, and then like the ballet technique was an hour and a half. And my first week teaching an hour and a half technique of ballet to middle school students was like impossible. And I'm fortunate enough to have like Pilates work that I could like add in as well. But we reduced like all the classes down to 45 to 50 minutes for certain age groups, and then 30 minutes for younger kids. And that's been really beneficial, I think, for their attention span. And as well as like, this is the only time that they've been home to like have dinner on 3 nights a week or something. So I think they're actually using that family time as well, which is also really important to consider. So the reducing the class time has actually been really beneficial for our students.
Great. Yeah, and for older students, Jen will speak to this more in a moment, but we were saying for a lot of these students, they're spending a lot of time online, doing all their schoolwork online. A lot of them are struggling with that switch. It might require more writing. They might not be very easy writers, and they're having to now, instead of discussion in class, they're having to write everything out. So there's a lot of fatigue. There's a lot of screen fatigue happening. And again, when I spoke to Paula Thompson, who's involved on the IADMS mental health panels, mm-hmm. she was saying how a shortened attention span is an appropriate response to anxiety. So, recognizing the anxiety that exists in this pandemic, and especially for those younger kids who maybe can't articulate or fully understand what's happening, they might have a much more somatic relationship rather than a cognitive relationship with their anxiety. And so that's easily distracted behavior is completely appropriate when you're in that fight or flight mode. That is evolutionarily the function of fight or flight, is to be vigilant and see every distraction and know where you need to run to, Yeah. So I think it really is about like shifting our expectations and moving fluidly with what's happening in the room.
And it's different, like really quickly on that point of if we're in our traditional dance space and one of my 8-year-olds is distracted and playing with something that they shouldn't be playing with, I'm always like, we don't play with that right now. We need to come back in. And it's like that, setting the boundaries within that space. Whereas here it's not necessarily, I don't want to use that time as a punishment.
Right.
I use it as like, hey, I see that you're really interested in something over there. Like, that's great. Is it something you can dance with right now? Like, I try to make it be like, I know you're distracted and I don't want to punish you for that distraction or make you feel that you shouldn't be distracted, because I'm easily distracted as well in my space. Mm-hmm. So try to using that as like a gentle coach or a gentle nudge versus it being like a stop doing that and you need to come back here. It's more of like again, going back to that, being sympathetic towards their situation.
Great. Anything that you'll take with you going forward? Anything that you want to share that's like worked well that you can imagine using as you go forward when we get back to studio time?
I think it's the point of the use of the warm-up. I mean, I think thankfully with my like city provider experience and like really having to study what a warm-up is and the most effective way to do that, the psychological component to a warm-up I am learning has such a great value to it. And I think I mistakenly it was kind of like the secondary tier to a warm-up. And I was always so focused on what a physical warm-up should be. And so I think that's something that I'll very much value. And then I think the sense of mindfulness of what my students are experiencing, because right now it's very evident what my students are experiencing. Their stress at school, their stress with living at home with younger siblings, their stress of having to go back and forth between parents' houses during a pandemic is also an added element. And I think that that's not always as obvious when we're in the dance studio space because I'm not seeing it.
Yeah.
But it's still there and it's still something that I can recognize. I'm learning a lot about my students' homes. And I'm not necessarily the expert to correct a home life or to reach out, but it's just something to know and be like, that child, I'm going to be a bit more patient with you today because it sounds like you switched to your settings or something like that. So I think having a bit more understanding into my students' lives has been very helpful to be able to guide them in dance and a dance class for a set amount of time.
That's really very interesting and great to hear. We have a few questions in terms, some of which I will save for later. And in fact, I think I'll move on to Jen here. And then after we hear from Jen, I'll address some of these questions that are coming up in the comment section. So Jen teaches university students. And I'm sure you have a lot of ways in which you can relate to what's already been said. But maybe you could sort of zoom out. And say Zoom without having a meeting. Maybe you could zoom out and kind of look at the big picture for us and sort of think about like what you're hearing that resonates, where you see some gaps, and sort of what you think about the bigger picture in terms of like the community of collegiate dance and our colleagues, and sort of give us a sense of a bigger picture scope on all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I echo 100% everything that Sonia and Sutton have said so far. I think this is a really difficult time for a lot of our students. It's a really difficult time for us as educators. It's been really overwhelming to sort of take this shift. And a lot of us have given, particularly in academia, we were given, a couple days to adjust and shift our classes. I think something that's kind of unique within the college dance setting is that we're grading our students. So that adds a whole other level of stress to the students and to the educators. We spend all this time creating these perfect syllabi, and they have learning outcomes and goals and timelines for topics we're going to cover. And suddenly that kind of got thrown out the window. And I was really proud of our faculty here and a lot of the dance faculty throughout the country and throughout the world. And in that we kind of rewrote our syllabus. We sort of sat down and said, okay, here's this new normal. Here's these new syllabi that we're going to follow. And it gave us a lot more flexibility with how to adapt to our student needs. Because I think when we start to try and fit the plan and fit the syllabus into the box, the literal box, like the 4x4 literal box, that's when we start to put ourselves at places of risk. Because we're trying to take something we know and adapt it to this new environment, as opposed to us adapting to the new environment. And so I think that was a big part of it, is like, and something I've been reflecting on a lot is, and as we move forward, is we must adapt to the students versus asking them to adapt to us. And that's a whole new concept. Even as we look at our dance classrooms and we say, oh yeah, we're really trying to like adapt to student needs and we're responding to their goals. Every time a dancer enters into a dance studio, we're asking them to adapt to our space. We're asking them to adapt to the rules that exist within a dance environment. And now we have to actually deconstruct what those rules are, and we need to adapt our expectations to what their new environments are. And I think that's a really important thing to kind of move forward with. I've also noticed, and something to sort of bring forward here, is I've noticed a lot of my dancers don't want to dance right now. And we've been sort of doing synchronous, asynchronous teaching. So, because we have students across the coast as well. So like asking a dancer to show up to an 8 o'clock class on the East Coast means that they're showing up for like 5 o'clock on 5 a.m. class. So we really haven't been doing a ton of synchronous training. But letting them know that it's okay to not dance during this time. That the studios will be there, their training will be there, they'll know how to do a tendu. This might be a different time for them. This might be a different phase in their training, and supporting them as they're kind of off season, supporting them as they're exploring other things, because dance needs to still bring them joy in some way. And asking them, a lot of my students have gotten so frustrated trying to put it into the space. Yes, and I've given a lot of them permission to say, no, it's okay. You don't have to do this right now. There'll be time. There'll be time in the future to do this. Let's do something else. Let's explore some other aspect of who you are as an artist, who you are as a mover. There's so many other components that make up who they are as humans, and allowing them to explore that and build themselves up as community members as well as dancers at this time, I think is really important. I think also something to consider for the university students, the college students, is that this is a really uncertain time for them, particularly if we look at our juniors and seniors as they're looking at graduating and they don't know what the future brings. We don't know what the future brings. It's really difficult for us to mentor them during this time. Because we don't know how things are going to shift. So keeping that like kind of in mind about their emotional well-being at this time, their futures are totally unknown, and supporting them the best we can through that process, I think, is really important.
I think those are great points. I want to, I like in particular that idea of like, we need to shift what we're expecting. Yeah, I think it's a time for pedagogical flexibility. Yeah.
I think also, I was doing a little like reflecting on this. I think I was in the shower this morning. That's when all really good reflections happen. But I was thinking about how, we talk so much about space, the space that we have, and being in control of the space. That's something that we're so used to as educators, is being in control of the spaces where our dancers are dancing, performing. We, like Sonia was saying, we do those assessments, those risk assessments. Every time that an educator goes into a space, hopefully you're doing a risk assessment for and you're unable to do that. And so losing control is something that's really difficult, and acknowledging that we're losing that control of our spaces.
That is very, there's a few studies out there on dancers and sense of control. So if anyone's interested, the studies exist. I want to go to a few questions that are out here. I think Karen made a point about sort of she was hearing what Sutton was saying and thinking about when students discover that a lot of their attachment to dance might be the social component. So I think a lot of things are revealed in terms of how a student learns during this time and also sort of what their relationship to dance is. And it's great to have a social attachment to dance. Dance comes from a place of social engagement. The earliest dances were people coming together and pounding on the ground to get the seeds to grow, right? So socialization is a critical part of dance, but it might be revealing when you discover that, or when a young person discovers, it's not the dancing that interests me as much. It's just being with those friends. So those are issues to make space for. And Paul and also some others, Robert, were talking about the benefit of the one-to-one, which I can say I've definitely seen. I'm actually really enjoying having some extra time to work one-on-one with people. And in terms of things we might take forward, I think we've all been forced onto this platform, which is not perfect, but is a tool that has certain benefits. And one of them might be this ability to work in a little bit more of a flexible way. Dance is always limited by the need for space. That is financially one of our big limitations. So knowing that there's this platform that's a little more flexible could actually pose valuable. Teal and Peter Lutine were all asking about sort of the pace of a class. And so I'm wondering if the three of you could maybe speak to that in terms of what you're finding, maybe what you recommend from a scientific evidence-based perspective, but also what you're finding in practice in terms of how to pace a class in this new world. Anyone want to go first with that?
Okay.
Sonia, sure.
Picking up on what everybody's been saying about, I've been thinking about dividing what we offer. This is for myself, those middle of the night things that you think about. Is what we offer as dance teachers is the training, the physicalness, the qualitative, connective sort of work that we do, and the social. I mean, you're absolutely right. That's what they're missing. They're missing their friends. They're missing being in the studio. They're missing touch. They're missing all of those things that we just can't find right now. So when we try and deliver something, I think our knee-jerk reaction has to be, I need to do what I normally do in a different way. You're absolutely right, Jen. We've been working in the way that we used to doing. And I think that we shouldn't be afraid to take things away and divide them. So maybe using our synchronous time to support them emotionally, discuss with them in smaller groups than we would maybe normally see, rather than in our large groups trying to teach a Zoom class online, that we're just sort of feeling like we're doing this. So separating out what we offer as dance teachers might be a way of dealing with this, that it's not something we would normally do. So checking with them, making them feel emotionally connected, maybe pinning them to each other, maybe doing study buddies, giving over to them. You mentioned autonomy, Jen, as well. Growing some skills that we try to develop in our dance classes, but maybe augmented in a very different way. So moving on from that statement to what's included and the pace of a class is perhaps more reflective time within the session that you deliver. So, okay, go away, let's pin each other together and talk about what we've just done, rather than physical doing all the time. So regarding pace and scale, it is just much, not slower as in a slow tempo, but a more contemplative, a more reflective approach in a way that we actually don't have time for when we do know. Feel we have to give our hour and a half, 2 hours, and they need to leave in a certain physical state and having feel like they've worked. And this is work in a different way. Mm-hmm. And I think we can encourage all sorts of developing skills by highlighting that, saying this is part of your learning. You might not be able to do it physically. You might not feel like you're going fast, hard, technically the thing that you want. But this is learning as well.
I think that's great. Someone on the comment section said that she's been using the screen share function in Zoom to bring in dance history, and I've been using that with anatomy. I screen share some anatomy, and who among us hasn't wished that our students had a better understanding of, who Louis Fuller was, or Lester Horton, or something, so I think using this as a chance, but you never have the time. You can't do that in the studio. There's an expectation that the studio be go, 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 dance, dance, dance. So I think maybe giving yourself permission as an educator to sort of explore these things, do a little more core work, and that those students who are constantly struggling with core support, well, this is a great time to look at that and delve into that, and allowing yourself that permission to work, as Jen was saying, with the environment that you have, and really working to those needs.
I think it's a perfect time to work on alignment, because you can see yourself. You can see yourself doing it. You can watch. You can organize. Mm-hmm. It's not like a mirror. It's something different that you can just have your own little private Zoom tutorial with the material that you've just seen from your teacher. You can really spend time on things that we don't often have time for in class. I know we work on alignment all the time, but it's sort of over time. This is maybe a more in-depth approach. When we can't do certain things, that it actually leaves more room for things that we really want to work on.
And I think if you need any support in that, just remind yourself that you're an educator of a whole dancer, so now is the time. You're not just an educator of a body or a technician, and now's the time that you can educate your whole dancer, the whole dancer that's in front of you. Anything you want to add to that, Jen?
I think one other thing, just adding on to what Sonia was saying, is that you can encourage them to also use this time to work on their artistry, to figure out who they are as movers for themselves. They don't have the mirror. They don't have all of this outside assessment, right? So they're actually able to take particularly the time that is asynchronous, and you're asking them to explore movement. They can take that time to explore what that means for themselves and how it applies to their own body. How can they become artists through this time as opposed to technicians? Because they'll have the technical base to come back to. We can coach them on that when they come back to the dance classroom. Now is the time for them to figure out how does a tendu actually feel in your body? Like, do 100 tendus. Let's really figure this out. Let's take the time to explore it.
Yes.
I think just to basically go right off of that was my students. It's like the adapting the expectations. So yes, I go in and I go into my classes with this, we're going to learn about this Horton technique today. And that's going to be our main focus. And usually in a dance studio, yes, I respond to where my dance, sometimes they're like, can we just do yoga today? And I'm like, no, we have to stay focused. Whereas in this setting, we went into class last week and my older students, I can see them doing all their TikTok dances and they can't even focus. I just see them going nonstop. And I was like, okay, that's where your body is today. So then they deconstructed that. It's make your own, take all these moves, make your own. So I allowed them to be creative. That was the most successful class we've had yet because they were 100% in ownership. So I think it's the response, which I think to Jen's point, she has a syllabus to work in and she has this grading expectation that she has to work in. Whereas studio owners, just because they're in a modern class doesn't mean I have to teach them modern technique. The parent is just happy that for 30, 40 minutes, their kid is not with them maybe, and they're going to move in a different way or they're going to think about something differently. So I think that studio owners give yourself that ability to just yes, have your plan and don't be too forgiving, but at the same time, know that you can just be where are you today? And let's respond to that today and what you need.
I think just to quickly add on to that point, Sutton, I think sometimes in this new environment, it's hard for us to be as adaptable as we might be in the dance classroom. I think a lot of times I go into a dance classroom and I'm not quite sure where it's going to go, but I kind of have this direction, and I'm able to adjust it based on what I'm seeing in the room. And that's a lot harder in this environment because we're not getting that energy back from the students in the same way. So figuring out, and I'm not sure I have the answer to this right now, but figuring out how can we be more adaptable within these synchronous settings. And that's a great example that you just provided.
Just to bring a little science in, since we're science people here, there's been a lot of studies. Eleanor does a lot of research on dance and self-determination theory, and one of the components of self-determination theory has to do with autonomy and the importance of autonomy and relatedness in a dance environment. And the studies have found that students who have that that autonomy and that sense of relatedness, and what's the third component of self-determination theory?
Belonging, competency, and
competency. Yes. That these are students who stay on and dance longer. They're more resilient. They tend to endure challenges more and come back to dance more readily. Thanks, Emma Redding, as well, for some of this research with CAT students, young students. So something to think about in terms of the importance of autonomy and relatedness and building competency in an independent way. These are not just things that sound nice. Like, there is evidence and data suggesting that these elements build better dancers. Similarly with identity. So all the research on identity will tell you again and again that having a myopic, a one-dimensional single identity is very dangerous. It's very problematic, and it tends to lead to crisis in times of, well, injury or global pandemic. So there's one study that looks at retired dancers and notices that the dancers who have a very singular identity on being a dancer really struggle and are much more likely to have a crisis in retirement. So you all as educators might be seeing that also. So we spoke earlier about the dancers who find, oh, I really just like hanging out with my friends. But you might also have dancers who are so singularly focused on their identity as dancers that this pandemic has a massive crisis for them because they cannot connect to that self. And so building complexity of identity. I had meetings with students recently, and several of them were like, "Oh, I'm really getting into cooking, and I'm sewing, and I'm doing these art projects." And again, when we think about the whole dancer, those are really important skills and identities for these dancers of all ages. Professional dancers to young children, to be tapping into, to discover, oh, I'm a really big part of my family, and I have a whole important role within my family. I'm not just a dancer. I'm also a sister. I'm also a caregiver to my little siblings or whatever. And again, that those things don't just sound nice. They are evidenced to be very beneficial for career longevity and health and mental health and even physical health. Anybody want to speak anything else to the psychological components? Yeah, Sonia.
Yeah, you mentioned self-determination and autonomy, how that's, we've all been there trying to figure out how we foster autonomy and how we don't spoon feed and how we give them life skills, be a normal person, not just a dancer. I know that sounds strange, but everybody will know what I mean. So the B, the ABC, the B is belonging. And that's what we're having to deal with now, that absence of belonging. So it's really important that we factor in that component to maintain that self-determination is gathering people, collecting people. And that, as we've been talking about, is not necessarily showing them how to dance online. It's finding an alternative, collective sense of being. And I think that's something we could all explore a lot more. I mean, we're used to with academic tutors, personal tutors, student helpers, counsellors, that we sort of tend to compartmentalize. That's that side and that's that side. And what you were saying about the whole dancer, I think is something that we could focus on, now that we have the time, that we're not just pushing the technicality, even though we don't do that. We don't predominantly do that. But you're right, there often is a very strong focus on, if I can't do this, I'm not a dancer.
Right.
There are so many other skills that bolster being a good technician: longevity, resilience. Working through the field. We want to be dancers for a long time, not just the dancers for this time.